Welcome back, Honors. All right, can you believe it? I can't believe it either. We're recording a weekend flip on a Friday before we even leave school. This way I can actually enjoy my weekend. You can enjoy your weekend. We can all move forward. You can bang this thing out early if you want to, etc., etc. But speaking of banging it out, let's get straight into it, shall we? Now, what we're talking about in this one is what we kind of talked about leaving off in class. We were discussing Islam in class, right? The Nation of Islam and its growth during the Middle Ages in Europe. And then we were talking about now the Crusades, right? Because if you look at a map of the Middle East and as well as the Byzantine and Western Europe during the Middle Ages, you can see that the growth of where Islam radiated out of was actually right nearby these Sassanid Persians who were over in the Iran, Iraq area coming through threatening the Byzantine all the time. And then the Byzantine was up here and they were constantly fighting wars with each other. But then the Nation of Islam grew up and out of the Arab or the Arabian Peninsula and went and then just pushed through, right? Actually converting a lot of those Sassanid Persians to Islam and bringing them into their culture as well, right? So the Crusades are going to break out, though, mainly due to the fact that, the Islamic people were dangerously close to Jerusalem, right? So speaking of Jerusalem, it is considered the holiest of lands for two large religions, and it is considered a very holy land for the third, right? We talked about in class, the big three monotheistic religions, right? The big three monotheistic religions are, Judaism, Christianity, and the Nation of Islam, right? So the big thing about it is, as many theologians are now concurrently believing, is that we are all working and praying towards the same entity, that we do not need to live in lives of ignorance, right? We actually need to accept people for who they are and not judge whole nations and religions of people based on the acts of some extremists, right? So, however, something you don't probably realize is that these religious set of wars, these crusades, were fought over this city, Jerusalem, right? Now, why is Jerusalem so important? Mainly due to the fact that it is a holy city that contains sites from the three major big faiths, right? So those three big monotheistic faiths. So right here, actually the one that's in the forefront, that is one of the walls, I believe, of the Temple of Solomon, right? So now that very, very famous wall is actually known as the Wailing Wall, right? It actually is a very famous site in the Judaic faith, and the many pilgrimages happen to that very, very famous of sites every single day. And they actually write small prayers and go through an entire prayer ceremony and then write small prayers on a piece of paper and then slide them into the cracks of the wall, right? To try and have a closer communication with their ancestors as well as God, right? So this, of course, being the Wailing Wall. Then over here we've got a very famous Muslim site, the Temple of the Rock, right? The Temple of the Rock is a very, very, very beautiful mausoleum to the Muslim faith, or I believe I don't think it's a mosque, but I believe it's a a famous religious building, right? And you can see the very, very famous Muslim architecture with the repeating geometric patterns, right? Very, very beautiful. As well as in Jerusalem, this is a minaret, right? A minaret tower, a call to prayer tower, right? So, and then also in this same city, it is where they believe Muhammad ascended into heaven, right? It's also in this same city that we believe Christ did a lot of his good works, as well as was baptized in this city as the first Christian, right? So as you can tell, this city is very, very famous and it's very, very holy. Well, the thing about it is Muslims are going to start taking control of it, right? So during the years following Muhammad and his message, the Muslim empire began to grow at a ridiculously expansive rate, right? They got very, very good at winning wars. They got very, very good at taking over different areas, and they got very, very good at taking over areas that were major trade routes, right? So they ended up taking over the entire Arabian Peninsula, all of North Africa, a bunch of southern Spain, and even also taking over the nation, or the city of Jerusalem, right? Which is located in the Middle East, of course, in modern-day Israel, right beneath Jordan and Lebanon, right? Now, these Muslim Turks, all right, the Ottoman Turks, are going to take control of Persia and other areas, which is going to lead the Byzantinians and the Byzantine emperor calling for help, right? So the Byzantine emperor at the time, being an Eastern Orthodox individual, calls the Roman Catholic Pope for reinforcement, right? And that Pope's name is Urban II. Very, very, very famous Pope, very important Pope. You got to put a star next to him, right? So Urban II holds this great big meeting after the Muslims begin to threaten the Holy Land and the Byzantine Empire. And he says, we must call a holy pilgrimage, right? We must call a holy pilgrimage to go and retake the Holy Land, right? Retake, right? Pilgrimage. So this called for a great pilgrimage to go retake the Holy Land at the Council of Clermont in 1095 AD, right? This is where they organized and decided to launch the very, very first Crusades. Urban II called for, which he shouldn't have done, all Christian warriors to go and fight the Turks. In a set of fiery sermons, you know what I mean, where he's standing on top of a big scaffold, he's like, these infidels, which is a terrible word to call them, have taken the Holy Land. Like have done all these other crazy things, even though ironically enough, a lot of historians now looking back on it believe this might have been economically motivated, because Jerusalem actually is also a very, very important trade hub and port, and then also it's like protected on one side by the Mediterranean Sea, and then like you've also got the Byzantine Empire right above it, right? It's actually like kind of a thoroughfare for like a lot of cash coming through as well, and also the pilgrimage money is a big thing too. When pilgrims go to Jerusalem, they end up having to pay tolls and taxes, and they bring items with them. So it ends up being a place like if you have the Holy Land, you can make a lot of money. So like anyway, but Urban II gives these like fiery sermons. He's like, we're gonna go take the Holy Land back. Da, 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 da. What he was expecting was to launch the first crusade to go all the way, walking, by the way, which would have been a long way, from different nations of Europe all the way through the Balkans, down and through Greece, then into Constantinople, and then Nicaea, and Dorlium, and Philippi, ding, 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 and then like go all the way down into Jerusalem, right? His plan was that 10,000 of these would show up, right? 10,000 crusading knights, right? Knights that would have full armor and have an emblazoned red cross. And they would also be ready for this battle. They would be military trained. They would be vassals of lords ready to go and conquer this territory. What he got, though, was a very, very large group of poor people at one point. All right, so there was several groups of knights that went. One large group in particular that was supposed to leave in 1096. But in 1095, in late 1095, this French guy really screwed up everything, all right? He heard the sermons at the Council of Clermont, and his name was Peter the Hermit, right? And Peter the Hermit, pictured right here, starts doing these own big preachings, and he's like, oh, he said all Christian warriors must go. And then so a lot of poor people and farmers and women and children and washed up knights decide that we're going to follow you to the Holy Land, Peter. And they decide to start going. And there's like 40,000 of them, and they're all super poor, uneducated, and ridiculous. All right, so they just get into a huge mess, because in the first crusade in 1096, 30,000 people answered the call, and only a small fraction of them were trained knights. Two big types of people are going to go out, of course, like I said. One giant group of peasants and garbage knights, and the other ones were actual crusaders that came in later, right? So these peasants and garbage knights, it actually was called the People's Crusade, right? The People's Crusade starts like walking through all of Europe along all these lines, and there's like ding, 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 coming mainly from Paris, and ding, 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 and along the way, poor people didn't even know where they were going, all right? So like they didn't even know where they're going, and every time they got to a big city, a lot of them apparently like, well, is this Jerusalem? They're speaking Italian, but is this Jerusalem? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And then they start like stealing food from other people. And you have to understand, like a group of untrained people is very chaotic. And they start like burning fields and like spreading disease and then like murdering people of other faiths, right? So as these poor crusaders push through to try and establish 4 states like within the Holy Land, they kind of massacred groups of Muslims and Jews along the way because they just overwhelmingly outnumbered them, right? So, and they ended up getting to Constantinople, and the emperor at the time knew that, like, if they didn't go escorted, because this dude Peter the Hermit, like, lost complete control of this crusade, like, way, way early on. And he knew for a fact that, like, a lot of people call this, like, the medieval Holocaust, because they think somewhere in the neighborhood of, like, 12,000 Jewish people were actually executed by this People's Crusade of poor people, while the other good crusading knights were actually assembling armor and getting ready to go, right? So, like, so the JV went in first and just ruined it for everybody. Now, they massacred these people along the way, and Peter had lost complete control of them by that point, and, like, then the Byzantine emperors, like, we don't know what to do with you. Just wait outside the city walls for a little while. And then they end up like looting and burning all the other places. And then they end up running into a huge Ottoman Turkish force of Muslims because the People's Crusade was a hilarious failure. Now, by the time these like brigands like get outside of Constantinople on the other side, they run into a huge group of Ottoman Turks and they just destroyed it. And like they like killed like the Ottoman Turks just wrecked this entire group of these this People's Crusaders, killing men, women, children, and only like 1,000 of them or so survived. So like 30,000 of them actually ended up getting executed after they, in turn, killed like 12,000 Jewish people. So the First Crusade was a big mess, right? But in the long run, the trained knights came along of the First Crusade, and they were strong enough following this People's Crusade to push all the way into the Holy Land, take Jerusalem for the Christians, and they established 4 new states. Now, a lot of y'all are like, what do you mean 4 new states? Well, the thing about it was, like, the Byzantine used to own all this land, and they used to kind of hold on to Jerusalem for the Christian community of Western Europe. But when the Crusading Knights, the varsity team, when, like, they get to the Byzantinians were trying to clean up after these People's Crusaders had come through. And so they're sitting there being like, oh, crap. Like, so, like, just go figure it out. And instead of investing in the areas that these people were taking over, the Crusading Knights, led by their own nobles, had to kind of establish like 4 independent little areas to govern and try to take control of after they took it back from the Turks, right? So in these 4 new states that they established were called Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, much like the Marine Corps song, like, to the shores of Tripoli, right? So now, even though Tripoli doesn't exist anymore, but still, these Christian Crusaders in the First Crusade, they get their first win, right? Yay! A win. All right, so like they actually get a win, and everybody else, including the Jewish people and the Muslim communities, have a 0, sort of, because they're all like dead. All right, so apparently there was one report of all these People's Crusaders forcing a huge city of Jewish people, men, women, and children, into a synagogue and like burning it while they were inside of it. It's absolutely terrible. Now, the Second Crusade, though, is when the Muslims are going to come back in, like about, I believe, close to 100 years later. It's in the 1140s, so it's around like 1144. They show up and they take one of these states, right? So they're like, we lost this land to these Christian brigands that killed all these people, and we want to take it back because then we can actually set up a military standpoint and then also keep attacking the Byzantine, and we can take over all the stuff we want, right? So the Muslims actually took control of one of these states. Specifically, the one they took control of was called Edessa, right? This like top northern one. And the reason why they were ended up actually able to take it over is because Edessa is not protected geographically by anything, right? So it's just out in the middle of the Turkish, like Eastern Europe, Turkish, the divide, like northern Syria. All right, so it's like actually just located in the middle of everything. Ironically enough, much like the Assyrians. Remember when we talked about the Assyrians and like their militaristic style came up because they were just like sitting out in the middle of everything? Well, Edessa was sitting out in the middle of everything. So they easily got attacked, and this state got lost, and they called for a second crusade, which was a big, fat, massive failure. Now, the Christians were able to hold on to Jerusalem. They held on to it for quite some time, but it still ended up being a big fat failure because they could never get Edessa back. And now the Muslims have taken one of those states, Edessa and Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, which are protected on their coasts by water, end up having the ability to stay with the Christians, right? So the Crusaders still have their one crusading victory, right? They got the first one, but then everybody else gets the second crusade victory, right? So it's 1-1 right now, right? But then the third crusade gets called. And the third crusade's crazy because this guy right here comes into play. Saladin, right? Which is the shortened version of his name, because his actual name is like, oh, I can't ever actually say it, but I know it's an Ibn in it. Ibn, I-B-N, and Ibn in Arabic means son of. So Saladin, full name. Not siege of Jerusalem. I just need his name. And Saladin's not actually his real name. It's the shortened version by the Europeans. I just said that. Here we go. Saladin. Here we go. An Nasir Salah Adin Yusuf Ibn Ayub. All right, so like that's his long name, right? So, but where he's from is he's from Egypt, right? So this, interestingly enough, like incorporates a very, very different like schematic, right? He's Egyptian, and you're like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry. My name is Allison Brooks, and I thought for a moment that you were talking about the fact that the Muslims originated out of the Arabian Peninsula. And Allison, this is where we would sit down and we would have a very long, drawn-out discussion about how the growth of the Muslim Empire was so great and so so dramatic that they actually even had the ability to convert other countries and other nations of people without even shedding a drop of blood, and Egypt was one of them, right? So Egypt adopted the Muslim faith wholeheartedly. And his uncle was one of the sultans of Egypt who got into a massive war with one of his other soldiers, right? And Saladin ends up calling for help from some of the crusading knights to be like, hey, y'all are in Jerusalem. Help us prevent this jerk who's going to step up and screw up all of our economies for us. Help us prevent him from actually taking over. And the Crusaders never answered the call, right? So he is very angry now. He's a very prideful Muslim, and he's a great dad. He's got 17 kids, all right? And he's an amazing general, and out of spite, Saladin goes in as the new Sultan of Egypt, who's a phenomenal general because he uses the geography of the Arabian Peninsula as well as the desert territories because he knows for a fact that Europeans can't fight in the desert to his advantage. And he attacks Jerusalem, and Jerusalem in the Third Crusade officially falls to the Muslim empires and goes into their their hands at the siege of Jerusalem. And he takes it, he erects new walls, he sieges the entire place, and bang, Saladin has now taken it. So 3 Christian leaders are going to answer the call to go and try and take Jerusalem back from Saladin, right? So those leaders are named Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II of France, and then this guy, who everybody wants to believe looks like this, but he doesn't because he's a crappy king that only lived in his country for 6 months. Oh, yeah, it's that guy we talked about earlier on, Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionhearted, right? And as we know, Richard's not the best king on the planet. All he cares about is fighting wars, and his brother King John ends up getting assigned little John. All right, ends up signing the Magna Carta in 1215 because he's dead. So many nobles are going to answer. So a couple of them are dumb. So the one guy, the German guy, Frederick Barbarossa, actually ends up answering the call first, and he takes a huge group of people through Germany and Austria. And at one point, he comes up on a river, and he's wearing a full suit of armor. And he's like, I bet you I can ford this river. And he tries to walk into the river, and then he drowns. So because his armor is weighing him down. So that's Frederick Barbarossa. But then Richard sets out with Philip II of France, and they hate each other. They can't stand each other because they're they're on the brink of fighting a civil war, and then King John's got to take over for a little while, and he ends up losing all of his land in France to Philip II. And they just can't stand each other, but they end up having to go fight this thing together anyway. And Philip ends up bailing early on, and King Richard the Lionheart ends up going, and he tries multiple times to take Jerusalem back, right? Multiple times. But Saladin is just too much for him. Saladin's a genius. He's a military tactician, and he actually sets up his encampment about 20 miles out into the desert where Richard is going to have to cross a huge amount of desert territory to actually take over Saladin's camp, right? Every time Richard journeys out through the desert, though, by the time he gets to Saladin's camp, his people are exhausted, they're dehydrated, and they're on the brink of death, so they can never actually take it from him. And Saladin actually respects Richard a lot. He respects him for his warrior class, and he's just like, all right, I understand you. But Richard ends up trying to return to England, even though he never actually got back, after never actually being able to capture Jerusalem. So the Crusaders still only have 1, and then everybody else has 2 now. And Richard the Lionheart's crusade in the Third Crusade was the very, very last legitimate crusade that really, really occurred. But there ended up being 9 total. So there were 6 more after this, right? A big one is when the Crusaders attack Constantinople and lead to a giant amount of disorganization. A lot of it has to do with this weird bounty, and the emperor, the Byzantine at the time, wasn't liked by this other guy who wanted to be the emperor of the Byzantine, and he pays a bunch of Christian knights to go in there and jack up Constantinople. So ironically enough, the Crusades end up being a big negative for the Byzantine Empire because they start faltering and falling during this time period. And then 5 more Crusades follow, but the Muslims remain in control of the Holy Land for the rest of the Middle Ages, right? So Crusaders still got the 1, and then everybody else wins. All right, so anyway, going forward, though, write in your notes really, really quick in big fat letters, the Children's Crusade, and we'll leave 4 or 5 lines of space. We're going to talk about that in class. It's a story I have to tell in class. But we do have a lot of effects of the Crusades, right? we've got some massive economic effects of the Crusades. So first of all, like the effects of the Crusades are kind of good and bad in a lot of ways. Mostly bad for us today. Good for if you're a rich lord in Europe or if you're the Pope. All right. So now, economically speaking, trade and trade goods are actually going to increase after the Crusades because of the travel and the movement of people. Right. Because again, cultural diffusion, war spreads ideas, economies, monies, cultural aspects. You know what I mean? Like it actually has a lot of positives in the long run when it comes to making money. But of course, one of the giant negatives of it is the loss of human life, right? So, which is absolutely disgusting. And then you have political changes as well, because a lot of these lords went off to fight the Crusades, and when they died and didn't come back, this led to the kings of their countries confiscating a lot of this land, making them much more powerful, giving them the ability to like centralize their area. And then also it gave younger lords the ability to like step up and take over a lot of these lands. So it gave power, like political changes, the biggest thing right next to it, it gave more power to some of the wealthy in Europe, right? So, and then socially speaking though, we are still feeling some of the effects of the Crusades, right? Because Christianity is going to, following the Crusades, is going to isolate itself away from other faiths, right? And in Western civilization, I personally believe that if you go back, that this is almost a direct causational line back to why so many Americans and Europeans and Westerners don't know much at all about the Muslim faith whatsoever, because ever since the Crusades, we have like deliberately isolated ourselves away from them, right? We've deliberately isolated ourselves, claiming that they're infidels that have taken something from us, and then, oh, look at these extremists and stuff, which we're still feeling these effects, and it's really depressing because the Muslim faith is a beautiful one, much like the Christian faith and the Judaic faith. They're gorgeous in all of their different facets, and the sad part about it is some wars from almost 1,000 years ago, or like several hundred, like over 500 years ago, have ruined our relationship with one another, right? So, and before the First Crusade, though, these are some weird facts. Crazy facts about the Crusades. Before the Crusade, like church power had like reached its height. Like Urban II, some people consider could have been a potential warlord. Was an economic swang. Like he owned an entire country known as the Papal States, right? Like they're all fighting wars and doing their own thing. And it had reached its giant power. But the thing about it, the example I gave you, like don't write this. Like in the 1080s, Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV, right? They end up like arguing back and forth with each other, and kings are getting excommunicated. And what is also going on, and Urban II realized this is the important part, star this, nobles and other leaders were constantly fighting each other in Western Europe, right? It was like the nobles of France hate the nobles from the Holy Roman Empire, and they're constantly at war with one another, trying to gain ground from each other and trying to make more money off of each other. And so the Pope decided, I'm losing money because the tithe is going to support these wars instead of going to support me directly. So a lot of people believe Urban II might have just actually wanted to unite Europe against a common enemy. Like he may have just wanted to get all the lords and nobles in Western Europe to stop fighting each other and then just go fight the Muslims instead. So, which is a really, really screwed up thing to even think about. And then also some other historians believe, some revisionist historians believe that Pope Urban never actually planned the Crusades to be a holy war, because we only like read about these speeches he gave from people who actually apparently heard it. And we know that people tend to exaggerate things, especially during the Middle Ages and also the Roman period. A lot of people believe that some historians believe that he might have actually just called it a pilgrimage, hoping that the Islams would attack the people, like the People's Crusade, like starting a whole war on its own. So underline that pilgrimage thing. It's very important. All right, but that's it. That's your weekend flip. Go ahead and get after it. I know it's a long one, but I like talking about the Crusades a lot, so I'll see you guys later. Have a great weekend. I'll talk